Amid reports of starvation, the UN warns of an imminent risk of further atrocities in Ethiopia. Human rights experts say perfect conditions exist for more crimes against humanity, including genocide, to be committed. They say investigations should continue, but can anything be done to stop these war crimes before they happen? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has long struggled with severe armed conflict. Various ethnic groups accuse others of attempts to exterminate their populations, while various governments have failed time and time again to pacify the nation as a whole. But now, UN experts say Ethiopia could be on the verge of even greater atrocities being committed, with almost all risk factors present. Here's a look now at some of the brutal dynamics at play in Ethiopia.
Ethiopia continues to go down a dangerous path. That's the latest from a UN report which reveals all 8 of the common risk factors of atrocity crimes are taking place in parts of the country. It expressed alarm over ongoing unrest in the Amhara region. Late September, 50 Amhara militia were killed during clashes against government security forces. And despite a 2021 ceasefire that ended a 3-year war between the government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the northwestern and southern parts of Tigray continue to experience instability. It also says there's alarming evidence of extrajudicial killings in the Afar region.
There is a very real and imminent risk that the situation will deteriorate further. And it is incumbent upon the international community to ensure that investigations persist so human rights violations can be addressed and the worst tragedies averted.
Aid restrictions have been one of the ways major donors like the US and the World Food Programme have placed pressure on all parties to keep the peace. But it's come at a significant human cost. The first medical assessment of hunger-related mortality in Tigray suggests such restrictions may have contributed to over 1,300 deaths since the ceasefire was brokered. On Tuesday, the European Union pledged $680 million in aid, having suspended an original $1 billion package because of atrocities committed during the war.
The multi-annual indicative program, which we are launching today, is the concrete first step towards normalization. It renews the EU's commitment to work together with the EU member states as part of Team Europe to contribute to Ethiopia's stability, post-conflict reconstruction, and macroeconomic recovery.
In the face of escalating insecurity and a dire humanitarian crisis, it's civilians who bear the brunt of these hardships and may just continue to do so.
So, with the dangers now fully identified, can further atrocities be prevented? Or are Ethiopia's civilians set to face more suffering and crimes against humanity? Joining me now to discuss that and more are from Washington, Odaa Tarbii. He's the international spokesperson of the Oromo Liberation Army. Also in Washington is Meaza Gebremedhin. She's an international relations specialist and community organizer at Omna, Tigray. And from Vienna is political commentator Moges Teshome. Thanks all so much for being with me. Well, as if it hasn't been bad enough for millions of Ethiopian civilians already, we're now hearing these investigators say to prepare for potentially worse. So Moges Teshome, I'll start with you. Do you agree that the situation is that bad and that more atrocities will occur? Or, now that it's been identified, measures can be taken to stop further crimes?
Thank you very much for having me. I agree with the statements that the situation is getting worse by the day, from bad to worse, because as per the UN experts who identified the risk factors that even after the signing of the Pretoria agreements, there have been atrocity crimes committed on a massive scale. And not to mention that there is extreme polarization and social fragmentation, which is one of the indicators. And the other being, of course, we have the pervasive culture of impunity, which was also a statement made by the Amnesty International's Horn of Africa director last year, which led to the cycle of violence. And now we have the food insecurity across the board. And for me, all this boils down to leadership crisis, which, in other words, to say, lack of good governance at the local and federal level. And so I agree with the fact that as things stand now, I do not see light at the end of the tunnel that justice can be served and lasting peace can be ensured. That is from my part. Thank you very much.
It's discouraging, to say the least, to hear that. But Meaza, are you on the same page? Will it go from bad to worse?
Yes, I most definitely am, and thanks for having me. Unfortunately for the civilians across the country, particularly those in Tigray, nothing has changed on the ground. If anything, the authorities have been emboldened by the lack of action from the international community to hold them accountable, and so they haven't changed in their way of handling civilians and disagreements, political or otherwise. And the fact that the international community is now on the verge of abandoning the only impartial and international investigation body puts the risk on the civilians. Eritreans are still deep in Tigray, other invading forces are still deep in Tigray. There are conflicts in Amhara, in Oromia, in Benshangul Gumuz, and elsewhere across the country, and civilians are being targeted left and right. And so, although there is a mounting effort to rehab Ethiopia's image by different international actors, but the fact on the ground remains that civilians are still at the receiving ends of all sorts of violation of their basic and fundamental human rights. And unless action is taken in the immediate term, then those who have been left so far are going to be receiving another round of crimes against them as well.
Okay, but Meaza, I know you in particular, as a Tigrayan, you said you are looking for accountability. So you encourage, further investigation, and you hope that the UN will continue with what they've been doing so that abuses don't continue with impunity. But how do you hold anyone accountable when each side has legitimate, even proof, that they have been victims of crimes against humanity committed by other tribes or by the government?
Yeah, most definitely. As a Tigrayan and as an advocate for human rights, I have been calling for an impartial and independent international investigation mechanism. And this is very important because all the people in Ethiopia across the board, be it those from Tigray, Amhara, Oromia, or elsewhere, are blaming the federal government and local authorities of violating their fundamental rights. And so this underscores the fact that no Ethiopian authority has the legitimacy nor the trust by the people to investigate these crimes, because it's the very government authorities that are blamed of committing the crimes. And so the only option we have at getting a viable and credible investigation into crimes and getting justice for what we endure as a collective is to have an international and independent. And that body is ICRI, the internationally mandated commission of experts that was established by the UN in 2021. Right. So we are pushing for that, but Europe and
again, realistically, Meaza, to what end? Because as you know, there are many who argue that you will never get real accountability because, again, everyone is guilty. So should there not be maybe the potential to look towards some kind of national reconciliation to stop the fighting now and start the rebuilding process if that's possible? Because the accountability seems to be creating even more animosity between all parties involved.
I would let other colleagues speak on behalf of their each community, but as a Tigrayan, I can guarantee you the only way to getting lasting peace in Ethiopia, and in Tigray for that matter, is to have real accountability for the crimes that were committed not only by local actors, but by regional actors, including Eritrea. We have to remember the war in Tigray was not a local conflict, it was an international conflict. And so the Ethiopian judiciary system, one, doesn't have the necessary political capacity and will to adjudicate these cases. Two, two, it doesn't have the jurisdiction to look at crimes committed by an international actor, which is Eritrea. And so as a Tigrayan, I can tell you the victims on the ground continue to call for an international mechanism that would, one, document the crimes that were committed impartially, and to have a referral mechanism to take it to ICC or other regional tribunal mechanisms that can be established by the UN. Trusting Ethiopia to get justice is literally trusting the TIF to investigate its own crime.
Okay, Odaa Tarbii, where does the Oromo Liberation Army stand on the exchange or the statements you've just heard?
I mean, we have been very vocal in regards to the importance of independent investigations for all human rights atrocities committed in that country. You mentioned that accountability will be difficult to get, but before we even talk about accountability, the truth must be established. Every year we see accusations being thrown around. Every year we see more and more atrocities being committed. We're seeing a very severe toll on the civilian population of the country. Civilians continue to suffer, but there are no clear answers on who is behind these atrocities, how are these atrocities being committed, who are commanding and giving the orders for these atrocities to be committed. All of this has to be established. There must be a truth established regarding these atrocities, and then we can move forward from there. And that has been our stance from the beginning.
Okay, then let me move forward with something with you, Odaa, because you have said that even if more security, for example, is put in place, there's also a dire need for effective monitoring to stop specifically local staff, who you say actually cause the misery and the suffering because they, for example, control the food aid. Describe what they're doing, why they're doing that, and to what end? Is it selfishness? Is it just corruption at its worst?
It is a mixture of opportunism, and also just because the environment does not require administrators to be accountable to the people, and that is at every level. That goes from the federal level to the regional to the district level. They do not feel accountable to the people. There is a culture of impunity within which they feel that they're above the law and above reproach. So the food theft was widely exposed because of the involvement of international organizations, but there were similar widespread theft of medical aid and fertilizer by administrators who take them and they sell them on the black market. And this is an open secret. Everybody knows it, especially within the country. And this has been a major cause behind the recent outbreak of cholera and malaria, particularly in Western Oromia, as well as malnutrition throughout the country. It is the major cause behind this has been the theft of food aid, as well as the theft of fertilizer, which was later sold on the black market. So this culture of impunity, this lack of accountability, the lack of any fear of electoral repercussions has just allowed these administrators to go do what they want, as long as they maintain the regime's power in the areas in which they administer. They do not fear any consequences for their actions.
And has food historically in Ethiopia been used also as a weapon of sorts? And we're just seeing that even on the micro level as well as the macro level now.
Absolutely. I mean, this is, we remember seeing that in the case of Ogaden in the past. Now we're seeing that in Tigray, and we're definitely seeing that in Oromia as well. Areas in which the regime considers to be a hotbed of opposition. That could be peaceful opposition included, where they feel that the Oromo political parties, opposition parties, have the most support. These areas are intentionally neglected. Food aid is not delivered in these areas. Fertilizer is severely rationed to only farmers that outright support the regime. Even medical aid. I mean, this recent malaria outbreak has started killing, at this point, dozens in the past month, but it is feared to grow as thousands have been infected. Even the distribution of malaria drugs in these areas have been severely curtailed because they're considered to be areas that do not support the regime. So yes, there is politically motivated restriction of very important goods and resources.
Moges Teshome, it seems just at every level, people are on the take and have little or no respect for the most vulnerable Ethiopians. Is that what Ethiopia is up against?
Yeah, thank you very much. But before that, I would like to just briefly comment on the fact that whenever we talk about the accountability and justice, we shouldn't be confining ourselves speaking on behalf of any specific community. And as far as that is concerned, I am here to speak on the entire Ethiopian people, as well as speaking the language of justice for everyone. That being said, the starting point for all of us, even to start a dialogue, is to put human security first. So that should be non-negotiable. And as it stands now, and even the international community are observing it, I think all colleagues here would agree with me that even the Pretoria Agreement was stipulated in the way that temporary peace at any cost. So not to ensure accountability, bring about justice, and holding those most responsible accountable for their crimes. And actually, they have been emboldened to commit crimes as we speak of. Regarding the looting of humanitarian aid, as well as the organized, I would rather call it an organized transnational crime of redirecting and diverting aid. That was common across the board, and the leadership is responsible for that, not only in Tigray and throughout Ethiopia, including the northern part of Ethiopia, and last week that happened in Gondar as well. So that I can see the contagion of impunity, and I can see clear leadership crisis and the failure. For me, I agree with the Amartya Sen, the famous quote that in any functioning government, there is no famine. Even when there is drought, as long as we have accountable and responsible government and good governance, then there won't be any acute famine as we are seeing in Ethiopia.
Okay. Moges, I'm going to stick with you because I'll kind of try to finish on this question, because you have said specifically that it is time to end this unwinnable war, you've called it. So how? I mean, what would an actual solution look like?
The actual solution would look like a concerted effort between a local remedy and local community and the international community. And what we see now is there is a disjuncture between the local needs and the role of the international community. So we have to start with that. And to that end, we need to really establish a robust transitional justice mechanism which does not compromise peace at the cost of justice and justice at the cost of peace. We can bring about lasting peace, but not with a transitional justice framework concocted by the regime in order to bide and buy time and escape international accountability. There must be a pressure from all Ethiopians in Ethiopia and diaspora community, as well as more involvement from the international community.
Meaza, does that sound feasible?
I think it's very important to highlight that the Ethiopian regime and its local counterparts cannot be trusted to bring about lasting peace in Ethiopia. In order for Ethiopia to be a lasting peace, there needs to be real political and legal accountability for the crimes that have been committed against civilians across the board, particularly in Tigray. And I don't see any problem advocating on behalf of millions of people of Tigray who have been suffering at the hands of the Ethiopian government and its allies. So I am here to speak against the atrocities being committed across the country, but also to emphasize the fact that the people of Tigray are still at the receiving end of a very silent genocide being committed by Ethiopian and Eritreans. So the solution is to bring about regime change in Ethiopia and to have real inclusive political dialogue that would put the people's interest at heart and not other rifling or political struggle within local authorities.
I mean, Odaa, regime change in what form?
Before we get into that, it's important to, I just wanted to talk about what Moges mentioned right now, which is the international community's insistence on temporary peace at any cost, there seems to be an idea that we can somehow reconcile Abiy's personal ambition to stay in power and his regime's ambition to stay in power with the demands of the various peoples of the country. And this is not very realistic. We have seen the lengths that the regime will go into to maintain its power. It will take very shallow cosmetic changes in order to appease the international community, where from where it gets its funds, where it's hoping very soon that it will be taken out of the will be brought back into the AGOA, and it's hoping that the sanctions will cease by merely appeasing the international community through very shallow cosmetic changes. But that is not a long-term solution. There does need to be accountability. There also needs to be an understanding that while the Abiy regime is in power, we will not be able to see the dialogue, the justice, and even any hope for independent investigation into the country is just a wish, because this regime is not willing to allow its crimes to be exposed, and for the world to truly see the extent of the suffering that it's put its people through.
Okay. Odaa, I'll tell you what, we do have a few minutes left. Or Moges, go ahead if you need to respond.
Yeah, just 30 seconds. Speaking of regime change, I think we need a preconditions before even advocating for a regime change. I agree that we need to have a regime change at some point, but there must be structural change which would serve as a springboard for a regime change. We need to address the structural causes of the civil war, the atrocities, and the political differences. And otherwise, we are going to end up in a vicious cycle without laying the foundation for political change and the transformation. That's what I wanted to comment. Okay.
Odaa, I'll just come back to you quickly, because as far as what's happening non-politically, actually, on the ground in Ethiopia, and this is another entire tragedy. It's not just conflict, for example, that's leading to the starvation that we're hearing about. There's also drought as well, and Ethiopia is one of those very unfortunate victims of kind of the worst of climate change. So talk about the non-conflict related threats that Ethiopians are also facing, and if those can even be addressed in the face of the violence that's still perpetuating on the ground.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a little bit difficult to separate the non-political issues from the politics, because the non-political issues were made much, much worse by the political situation. Even though there was a drought, and the same communities that were the most vulnerable to these droughts were forced to provide livestock and resources to the military during its campaigns in Oromia and Tigray, which made the situation much worse. The people who would otherwise be farming or supporting the families were forcefully conscripted and sent off to the war. And of course, like I mentioned before, even with the drought situation, there are existing mechanisms meant to stop those kind of situations from getting worse, to ensure that people still do have access to food. But because of the political problems, because of the lack of accountability, those mechanisms were hijacked and used for personal enrichment by the officials. So, while there is a whole host of non-political issues in Oromia and the rest of the country, the political side is impossible to ignore, because they have exacerbated the situation throughout the country and in all the situations, including the outbreak of diseases such as cholera and malaria, the malnutrition that's exploded in areas which have never had drought, in Western Oromia, for example, which has never had drought, where famine is not something people are familiar with, but they're currently facing malnutrition because of the political crisis. They're currently facing a spread of diseases because of the political crisis.
Okay.
I would just reiterate, it's impossible to separate the two issues.
They're hand in hand. Okay, Odaa Tarbii, that will unfortunately have to be the last word for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd really like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. I'll see you next time.